Good morning. Good morning. Oh, we're going to do this one more time. Come on, y'all. Good morning. There we go. You're getting a little bit better. My name is Laura Boren, and I serve as the Vice President for Student Engagement and Success. And on behalf of GSW's President, Dr. Neil Weaver, I want to welcome you to GSW's Convocation focused on recognizing servicemen and women who have been or are prisoners of war and missing in action. The United States Nationals POW MIA Recognition Day is observed across the nation on the third Friday of September each year, which is this Friday, September 20th. The point of POW MIA Recognition Day is to ensure that Americans remember to stand behind those who serve and to make sure we do everything we can to account for those who've never returned. In our very own community, we are lucky to have Andersonville National Historic Site, comprised of 3 distinct components: the former site of Camp Sumter Military Prison, the Anderson National Cemetery, and the National Prisoner of War Museum, which opened in 1998 to honor all United States prisoners of war in all wars. If you have not visited Andersonville National Historic Site, I highly encourage you to do so. Today's program is brought to us by the Anderson National Historic Site. I have the honor of introducing our Convocation guest speaker. Retired Colonel Robert Surton was born in Savannah, Georgia. He graduated from Emory University in Atlanta with a degree in history. He was then commissioned in the United States Air Force and became a B-52 navigator. He flew over 100 missions over Southeast Asia in 1971 and 1972. Colonel Surton was shot down and captured in December 1972. He was a prisoner of war until the Vietnam War ended in 1979. Following the war, Colonel Surton attended the School of Theology and Episcopal Church Seminary in Sewanee, Tennessee. He was ordained as a priest in 1976 after he received his Master's of Divinity degree. In 1990, he was awarded his doctorate in ministry degree from the School of Theology and served as a military chaplain in the United States Air Force. When former President Gerald R. Ford died in late 2006, Surton led all the memorial services and presided at his burial in Michigan. Today, Surton serves as the National Commander of the American Ex-Prisoners of War Organization. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Colonel Surton to the stage.
Well, it's good to be back in my roots. My mother's from Wiggum. That's where my parents met. Married later in Columbus. As you heard, I grew up in Savannah. Well, I've grown older. Growing up, I've discovered, is an option. Growing older is required. Just keep that in mind. All right, and what I want to do is go through kind of quickly my experience as a prisoner of war, talk about resilience, talk about why we do what we do, because all of this happened before you were born. I was 21 years old when I graduated from college. Next slide. Now, back in 1972, in October of 1972, Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State at the time, came home from Paris, France, and announced that peace is at hand, because he had a substantive agreement with North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong and the U.S. to sign a treaty. And I was on Guam at the time flying combat, and I thought, all right, this is going to be over soon. And then, next slide, what happened the next week was Election Day. And on Election Day, Richard Nixon, who was a very popular president and running against a fairly unpopular Democrat, won in a landslide, the largest ever in the popular and electoral votes for president. but that both houses of Congress went to the other party. And so at that point, I think the president's concern was that when that new Congress was seated in January, funding for the war in Vietnam would be cut off, and the prisoners of war would be left for debate and negotiation at a later time and languish much longer in Hanoi. So as soon as Congress took their Christmas break, the president ordered the bombing B-52s to go against Hanoi and Haiphong. Next slide. That's a B-52, they're still flying. The H model is still flying. I flew Ds and Gs. Ds out of Thailand for 50 missions in 1971, then G models off of the island of Guam in 1972, and that's sort of what it looked like at the time. Next slide. 18th of December, the Linebacker II kicked off, and for 11 nights in December, heavy bombing, over 750 B-52 strikes against the city, and just keep scrolling through that. There we go, 729 B-52 sorties. I was being the first one shot down on the first night. I got to be on the ground for about 700 of those. It's an impressive sound, I'll tell you that right now. 15,000 tons of bombs were dropped over the city. They fired 1,240 SAMs at us. 2 of them hit my airplane. 15 B-52s were shot down. 5 of those got away, and the crews ejected over Thailand or South Vietnam and were rescued. The 10 that went down over the city had 61 people on board. The normal crew was 6. We had 1 with an airborne commander, an extra crew member, and so of the 61 who went down, 32 of us survived, the others died in action. Keep going through that. B-52's gunners shot down 2 MiGs, and no MiGs shot down us, but then MiGs didn't fly when SAMs were in the air because they didn't want to get shot down by their own surface-to-air missiles. And it resulted in a ceasefire agreement and a treaty that was signed at the end of January, and the release of 591 prisoners of war being held in North and South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and then all of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese warriors who were being held in the South were also released and repatriated to their own country. When we came in for our mission, first, a couple of things about this mission. First of all, it was the day my crew was supposed to go back to the States. We were at the end of our tour, and on Friday, the word came down that all missions Saturday and Sunday were canceled. All crews were being crew rest, and so that meant no drinking, no corral, go to bed early, get plenty of sleep, and be ready for something on Monday. So on Monday, we walked into the mission briefing, and this is what it looked like. The red circle is where charcoal flight is. We were originally scheduled in a different position, but a couple of airplanes in front of us had to abort. The airplanes couldn't take off, so those crews went to the back of the line, and everybody else moved up one. So we wound up taking off as Charcoal 1. All those little black arrow shapes are B-52 cells. A cell is 3 B-52s. And you'll see all the targets seem to converge in roughly the same part. It was an industrial railroad complex in the northeast corner of the city of Hanoi. We had come from Guam, which is way to the east. We'd flown 8.5 hours to get here. We flew over South Vietnam and then up through Laos to the west, on the west of Hanoi, up to nearly to China border. The heavy dashed line up there is the radar coverage out of China. And so and then you can see the China border, which is sort of a dark gray snake-like effect in the northwest, but the upper left-hand side and upper right-hand side. And then we turned in south to come against the city. The reason we did it this way was because the Navy, flying off of ships, were doing the work in the harbor town of Haiphong. And so in order to keep us from running into them and them from running into us, we were on the west. We came in from the west. And we could fly for approximately 16 hours without refueling. So it's not like we didn't have enough fuel. We also discovered the only time you have too much fuel is when you're on fire. Okay, next slide. So the events of the day. Again, it was our rotation date. We were supposed to go back to Arkansas, and it was canceled. Then as we were lined up to taxi out to the end of the runway, we had an earth tremor. Not a good sign. And next, because as I said, 2 airplanes had to turn out of line, we moved up from Charcoal 3 to Charcoal 1. And so that's where we stayed. And then as we took off, the airplane wouldn't pressurize, and the bombardier and I had to get out our manual to tell us how to find the problem and fix it, which we had to do, because if we couldn't pressurize the cabin, we couldn't fly the mission. When we were rendezvousing with our tanker over the Pacific Ocean near the Philippines, we had some trouble getting a hold of the right tanker. There were 2 tankers out there indicating they were our tanker, and we rendezvoused with the wrong one, and then had to sort all that out and get straightened. Over South Vietnam, then, the wave that we were leading, we were the lead airplane now of the charcoal cell, but we had 2 cells behind us, so there were 9 airplanes together. And we were moving to be in 1 mile separation, nose to tail. And as we got to the compression point where we're to move to that point, the 2 cells behind us discovered they were scheduled to be at that point at the same time and the same altitude. And so they had to sort that out instantly to keep from running into one another. As we turned north, we knew that as we turned into the bomb run, we would enter a jet stream with about a 90-knot tailwind. My job as a navigator was to make sure that we would be exactly on time. So all the way across the Pacific, over 8 hours of flying, I had to make sure that we were on course and on time, and that we would be on time when we got to the target. And that's what happened. We were going to be exactly on time, on altitude, and on target. And everything was working really well in the airplane until 10 seconds to go on the bomb run. Thank you. At 15 seconds to go on the bomb run, we opened the bomb bay doors, and somewhere around 10 seconds, we got hit by the first of 2 surface-to-air missiles, which is really bad news. In part because it immediately killed our gunner, it mortally wounded our pilot, and we lost the engines. Jet engines, when a SAM hits it, the missile does not hit the airplane, the missile blows up. And then big pieces of hot metal about this big then slam into the airplane going 1,800 feet per second. And if a jet engine ingests one of those, the engine gets destroyed. So we lost engines, we lost power, we lost electrical power, we lost the bombing system. We had to drop the bombs manually, and as we were doing that, we were on fire. And the fire was right behind the crew position and right below the main mid-body fuel tank, which had about 10,000 pounds of JP4 in it. And so at that point, it was time to leave the airplane. So we ejected, and that was another saying that we carry in combat aviation, is generally unwise to eject over the target you just bombed. And so we dropped the bombs and within seconds had ejected from the aircraft. We were at 35,000 feet, so I free fell for 20,000 feet, which is because you need to get down where it's not 55 degrees below 0 centigrade, and you have to slow down because we're going at aircraft speed when we first eject. And so by the time we get to 15,000, you can breathe without the oxygen mask, and it was a lot warmer. As the parachute opened, I looked down between my combat boots, and I was hanging right over the target at 14,000 feet and watching 750-pound bombs from the airplanes behind us walk right between my feet and through the target area. Big rectangular fire. So I grabbed the risers on my right hand of my chute, pulled them to my ankles, which tilted the chute and caught the wind that was coming off the coast, and I drifted off to the west and drifted for it took about another 15 minutes to get to the ground, and I'm probably about 10 to 20 kilometers to the west of the target before I touched down. That's what a surface-to-air missile looks like. You can see the people on there. That's a big thing, 30 feet long. And when it next push there, that's what happens. It's like a shotgun shell. It's as I said, it blows up in front of you, and now it spreads out, and then all those millions of pieces of shrapnel cut through the airplane, killing crew members and taking out engines and destroying the aircraft. Next slide. Over the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of Haiphong, KC-135s, that's what that is, were in orbit to refuel the fighters that were coming out in and out doing their part of the mission, and one of them was crewed by my brother. He saw my airplane get hit and go down, and he knew I was supposed to have gone home that day, but he told me probably 25 years later, he had this sick feeling that I was in the airplane, and he found out the next day that I indeed was, but by then they also had my name as a certified prisoner of war and not as missing in action or killed in action. Next slide. 10 B-52s went down. One of them crashed in a little lake in the middle of town, and I think it's still there. They left it there as kind of a monument to their capabilities. Where my airplane crashed, they built this monument here. And next slide. So the next day, there were 6 of us in custody, 2 from my crew, me and my electronic warfare officer, and 4 from the next B-52 to get shot down. Just click on those till they That's me on the left, my AW on the right, and then the bombardier, co-pilot, electronic warfare officer, and pilot from another B-52. So the next day, they called the North Vietnamese had called an international press corps together for a press conference to show us off, because they were very proud of having shot down B-52s. And so that's where those pictures were taken. We were taken in one at a time. Next slide. The Hanoi Hilton. The real name of the place is the Wallow Prison, and it was built by the French when this French Indochina was a colony of France, and it was to house Vietnamese prisoners. And there were a number of sections in there, and that's the most familiar of the prisons from the Vietnam War, and the largest. Next slide. The second one in town in Hanoi was called the Plantation. You can see the big house over there. That's the theater is where they took us for the press conference. Next slide. And then the third one was what we called the zoo. And that was where I wound up. In mid-January, they reorganized the prisoners in order of shoot-down date. And so the oldest prisoners and the wounded from December were kept at the Hilton, and the newest prisoners were over at the zoo. So being fairly new, then that's where I was. I started out in the pool hall, then the stable, then the pigsty. And spent my last month or so in the pigsty. The swimming pool there it was a swimming pool, but it was so murkily, yucky green that you didn't want to put your hand in it. And they wouldn't let you swim anyway. There were walls between each of those sections, so you couldn't really converse across the wall very easily. Next. So that's what the buildings look like, photographs of that. The picture on the lower right, that's me kind of in the middle. And that was the day we were being released. Next slide. Treatment. Not too bad at that point in the war. The torture, which had been pretty awful for many years, ended in late 1969. And here's what I endured during my time there. Next slide. The diet was, it's easy to tell you exactly what we had. That was breakfast. Lunch and dinner was the same. The only couple of differences to all of that was on Sunday we didn't get but two meals instead of three. And on holidays like Christmas and New Year's and Tet, the Chinese New Year, and our going home, we had a special meal with eggs and chopped up duck or chicken or some kind of fowl. Okay, next. Day of release, 29th of March, 1973, 100 days after I was shot down. Then we were released. We were the last group to be taken out of Hanoi on the last of the releases. The treaty was signed the end of January, then the releases were every other weekend, starting in mid-February until the end of March. Got home to the United States on the 1st of April Fool's Day, and spent some time in a medical center in Illinois at Scott Air Force Base, and then came back to Blytheville. Now, that was 100 days out of my life. That does not define who I am, nor has it kept me in prison the whole time. So as you heard, I went on to seminary after that, and at this point, my wife and I have been married for 46 years. She married me in a fever in May, which was a month before we planned to get married because I was deploying the day after. And then my crew didn't go for about 6 weeks. So we had 6 weeks together before I left. And then, as I said, the day I was supposed to come home to her was the day we got shot down. So I spent another 100 days away from her. But so, and she stayed with me all that time. She's over here somewhere. There she is. And then I went to the Air Force. Yeah, thank you, dear. Military spouses are a unique breed of people because the military member is deployed so often and so regularly that the spouse has to be not only strong in their commitment to the spouse, but also the engineer of finances and household and child rearing for that family. And then, so it takes this very special person to be married to somebody in the military. We were blessed to have a son and a daughter. Our daughter is married and has 2 children. All 4 of them live in Little Rock, Arkansas at this point. And then as a clergyman, I've led 6 congregations from Georgia to California, all of which have been south of I-40 because my wife told God she would follow me, stay with me as long as she didn't have to go north of the frost line. If it got cold and snowed, she didn't want to go there. So it's all across, mostly along I-20 and I-10. I was promoted all the way to colonel. I retired as a colonel, left in 1999. I'd been in 30 years and retired out of the Air Force Academy in 1999. I've met 9 presidents in my lifetime. I met President Johnson when I was in college and was working up in Washington during the summers. President Nixon at dinner at the White House when we came home from Vietnam in 1973. Gerald Ford was a parishioner of mine when I served a church in California. And Jimmy Carter, we met when he was running for his 2nd term. Met him in Jackson, Mississippi when we were living nearby, and then he was with us for President Ford's funeral. Reagan was governor of California when we met him at a POW reunion in San Antonio. George H.W. Bush, we met not only at various places, including his church in Houston, Bill Clinton at President Ford's funeral, George W. Bush at the Ford funeral, and Barack Obama at the White House for breakfast one day. So it's been an amazing kind of a life for a boy from South Georgia who really never aspired to any of that. And it's been a good life. Next slide, if there is one. I wrote a book that came out in 2003, in part because I was trying to understand how the you can take the boy out of the war, but you can't take the war out of the boy, and how the war affected various attitudes and behaviors on my part. And so I started writing it and sharing it with a cognitive behavior therapist who was working with me. And then I started sharing it around with people. They wanted to know more. And then some crazy publisher asked me if I'd finish the story for the post-war story, and he would publish it for us. And so it came out in 2003. Keep going all through this one. So I did a lot of research. I had to go and read details about Linebacker II and the end of the war in Vietnam. And it took me a couple of years to write it. I would get up early in the morning, write for 2 hours, go to work. It came out as a hardback book in 2003. We've republished it as a softback a few times, and it's available now only on Kindle or in the used book market. And I also have my oral history story, both on Witness to War and for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. So 2 long interviews if you're really interested. Okay, and then one of my career high points was being asked to do the funeral for President Gerald Ford, and the second one was to do the opening invocation Republican National Convention for my fellow prisoner of war, John McCain. And so those were 2 big deals in my life. And then the final slide, the story is that was my book, Unchained Eagle. And then I have a friend who also flew B-52s who wrote another book, a sort of a tongue-in-cheek version of Linebacker II, called it Yankee Air Pirates, and which he counted as being terribly funny. And he used my book as some of the background. Now we have some time. So I wanted to have time in case you had any questions that you wanted to ask me about anything that I've said, rather than boring you forever. Any questions? Anybody have anything? Oh my goodness. Was anybody, were you all on your iPhones? Were you checking your emails? What was going on here? Nothing? Oh, wait a minute, somebody's pointing. Yes, ma'am. Okay, question is about balancing stress and leadership. Well, stress sometimes puts you in a position where you have to exercise leadership. One of the things we did in the prison was immediately, as we were put in cells with more than one other person, more than just ourselves, which for me was night 2, to find out who had the date of rank. And we organized very quickly by date of rank. It didn't matter what service, because we were mostly Air Force and Navy, but there were some Army there too. And then the senior ranking officer took charge, and we all knew where we stood. And so we organized ourselves for resistance to exploitation and interrogation. The interrogation, we were trained to do interrogation, but survival school. I was 22 when I did that, and I thought, I'll never need this. One of the remarkable things about taking boring training that you're never going to implement into you and doing it and repeating it is that when you do need it, you've got it. And so, for instance, I've been struggling with an allergy for about a month, which is really irritating. But when we were in the airplane, I almost lost both arms. because I almost ejected incorrectly. And I remember just as I was about, the navigator's ejection seat goes down, and there's a handle between your knees that you pull up. And if you pull it up this way, which is what I started to do, your elbows stick outside the seat and stay inside the airplane when you leave it. Just rips your arms right off. And just as I was putting pressure on, I remembered that's wrong. And it just came like this. And so then I was able to turn around and do this so that my elbows were tucked. So that was one. And then the training on interrogation, which we did at an Air Force base in Washington State, was very helpful because I kind of knew what was going to happen next. The name, rank, service number, date of birth stuff was out the window. They told us that that'll get you brutalized. So always have a cover story that with very few details that you can remember no matter what happens. And so I didn't have one of those because I was flying B-52s and we never flew into high threat areas, and besides that we're invincible, and I was only 25 years old and I did not have fully myelinated frontal lobes, which meant I was invincible. And that's why young men and women are willing to go into battle, because they know the bullet has somebody else's name on it. And so when I was being interrogated, they would ask me all kinds of questions, and so my on-the-fly cover story was I was a celestial navigator. And all I did was navigate over water using the sun or the stars to locate our position. And then once we got over land, the radar navigator took over using the radar. And they weren't happy with that answer, but that's all they got. And because they called a press conference, then they weren't going to make me look bad. They already told the International Press Corps that they had 6 of us. They had to show 6. And so once the cameras were there, I knew that I was going home. I just didn't know exactly when. And so that's part of it. Now, the thing about living there is in that kind of a situation, is that you become very, very close with your fellow warriors. And one of the things I learned back then was that in that kind of a situation, the primary motivation for resiliency and loyalty is not about the flag, it's not about apple pie, it's not about mom, it's not about family, it's about your other warriors. We do anything to protect each other. Now, taking that into the church when I came home is that you find the people who can do a job. You give them a job to do, and then you don't micromanage it. Because if you do, it'll add stress to their life, and you'll wind up doing their job for them. Because they'll say, to heck with this, if you're going to tell me what to do, you can do it. Cut out the middleman. And so stress will do that. Stress has a way of building us up and it's making us stronger. It's just like working out in the gym and doing physical exercises in order to strengthen your body. And so stress can strengthen your resilience, it can strengthen your faith, it can strengthen your relationships with other people. It can also come around and bite you in the butt from time to time. And that's when stress becomes dysfunction. And then you have to do something about it. And that's where writing the book came from. Because I was discovering early on as a clergyman, I would get tense and during the season of Advent in the lead up to Christmas, and I would stay tense until Easter was over. And I always said, well, for an Episcopalian, which is what I am, that's the busiest time of the church year. Christmas, then Lent, then Easter, all kinds of things are going on. And so I was thinking all that stress was caused by lay people in the church calendar. I was home 10 years before I realized it was also the bookends of my imprisonment. I was shot down a week before Christmas. I came home a week before Holy Week in the spring. And so somewhere along the line, my prison experience in some way was being part of the stress I was feeling in the church's calendar. And then it was another 20 years before I also connected that I did 7 capital stewardship campaigns, big fundraising events. And we always did those starting around Thanksgiving and going till Easter. And by the time we were going to be complete and successful, I was putting out resumes and looking for a new job. And that's when I realized that the stress of that time being 1972, and particularly that last mission I flew, was affecting my stress level under a completely different set of circumstances, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down in history. And so my responses were inappropriate for the amount of actual stress that was there. And that's when I started writing the book, and that's when I got into cognitive behavioral therapy, and then later into EMDR therapy to try to break that cycle and get rid of it. So I did one more capital stewardship drive after that, and that time we ended at Thanksgiving instead of starting. But so you have to go back and recognize why is it that today, in freedom and in working in my whatever job and career that I'm in, am I experiencing stress that seems to be driven by something other than the current circumstances? What is it in my history that I need to go back and review and come to terms with? And so that was a 30-year process for me. One of the reasons I wrote the book and had it published was that so people could actually read it and then maybe say, I don't need to wait 30 years like that dumbcoff did. I can do that now. I can deal with this early on in my own career. Now, I was not unsuccessful in my career. As you see, I was promoted about as high as you can go as a chaplain. And I did some really wonderful things in churches around the country and retired from that, and then have been very busy ever since. I've served on advisory boards for the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs and a variety of other things. So the stress eventually, the one that was eating my lunch from time to time, that stress we captured and then turned into a strength. And that's the important thing about resilience, is you take the stresses and you make them into something useful. Does that answer your question at all? Okay, is there anything else? Well, then I thank you for your attention and for your time today. I know that you have classes to get back to, and you're probably really eager to get there. And who's in charge of this? Are you in charge of this? Do we have anything else to say or do? Okay, can I dismiss these people? I won't do it in the military station, but thank you again, and God bless you all, and have a great week.